She was 2 points from history, and she didn't even know it yet because sometimes the body keeps score long after the mind has stopped counting, and what happened to Alex Eala in Cincinnati is one of those stories that looks like a simple loss on paper, but turns into something much bigger the moment you start pulling at the threads. So stick with me, because by the end of this you're going to understand why a scoreline can lie to you even when every single number on it is true. Just weeks earlier, Eala had been the story nobody could stop talking about, a rising Filipino star who had already beaten 9 top 10 players in her young career, who had just claimed her first WTA title, who had strung together 5 straight wins over some of the most dangerous women in tennis, and who arrived in Cincinnati as the 17th seed, the best seeding of her life at a WTA 1000 event. This was a player on the rise, a player who had every reason to walk onto that court believing she belonged among the elite. And for a while, that's exactly what it looked like. She took the opening set. She raced out to a 2-games-to-love lead in the deciding set. She stood 5 points away from what would have been a career-defining scalp, a 10th win over a top 10 opponent that would have sent a message to the entire tour. And then, in a stretch that still doesn't quite make sense if you only look at the scoreboard, it all came apart. 6 straight games disappeared. The match slipped away in what felt like an instant, even though the whole battle had taken 2 hours and 28 minutes to unfold. The tennis world watched a collapse nobody predicted, and for days afterward, people were left asking the same question. What actually happened out there? Because this wasn't a case of a better player simply outclassing a weaker one. This was something stranger, something that would only make sense once the deeper numbers came out. Let's rewind and set the stage properly, because context is everything here. Her opponent that day was Amanda Anisimova, the world number 10, the 9th seed, a 24-year-old American who carries the weight of being a former world number 3 and a 2-time Grand Slam finalist. On paper, that sounds like a fearsome resume, but Anisimova was walking into Cincinnati in a rough patch. She had won just one of her last 6 matches against top 20 competition heading into the tournament. She had dropped 5 straight to players ranked inside the top 20. She had only managed to play 20 matches all year because of injury troubles that kept pulling her off tour. This was a former elite player searching for the version of herself that used to terrify opponents, trying to rediscover rhythm after a stretch that had clearly shaken her confidence. So when these two walked out onto the court, the storylines couldn't have been more different. On one side, a 21-year-old rising star riding the best momentum of her career. On the other, a former top 3 player trying to remember how to win. If you had to pick a favorite based purely on form, most people would have leaned toward Eala, and for a set and a half, that red on the match looked exactly right. The first set alone tells you everything you need to know about how physically demanding this contest was going to be. It wasn't just long, it was brutal, the kind of set that leaves fingerprints on a player's legs for days. The critical moment came in the 5th game, a game that stretched on for 20 minutes and 11 seconds, an eternity by tennis standards, filled with 13 deuces and 8 break-point chances that Anisimova couldn't convert. Think about that for a second. 8 separate opportunities to break serve. 8 times Eala had to reach into whatever reserve she had left and find a way to survive, and she did it again and again, refusing to fold, holding her nerve point after point until she finally closed out the game and moved ahead 3 games to 2. It's the kind of game commentators talk about for years, the kind of resistance that looks heroic in the moment. But heroism in tennis has a price, and that price doesn't always get paid immediately. Anisimova did eventually find her break, taking the 7th game to love to move ahead 4 games to 3, and for a moment, it looked like the American might be settling into control. But Eala answered immediately, showing exactly the kind of fight that had defined her recent run. She broke straight back in the 8th game, held her own serve to retake the lead, and then pushed hard on Anisimova's serve in the 10th game to close out the set entirely. 67 minutes had passed by the time that first set ended, which on its own is close to the length of an entire match for plenty of players on tour. Eala had won it, and won it in dramatic fashion, but here's the thing about tennis that casual viewers sometimes miss. Winning a brutal set doesn't just cost you time. It costs you something you can't see on a stat sheet in the moment, something that only reveals itself later, when your legs stop responding the way they used to just an hour earlier. That marathon fifth game in particular had forced Eala to cover more court, chase down more balls, and burn more energy than most players spend across several entire sets combined. It didn't show up as a visible injury or a cramp in real time. It was quieter than that, a slow drain happening beneath the surface, while the scoreboard kept insisting everything was fine. The second set is where the story starts to shift, and if you know anything about how fatigue creeps into a tennis match, this is exactly the pattern you'd expect to see. Both players traded holds through the opening 6 games, the set sitting at 3 games apiece, tight and even. Then Anisimova found the opening she needed, breaking serve in the 7th game to move ahead 4 games to 3. This time, unlike the first set, Eala couldn't respond immediately. Anisimova held her own serve in the 8th game to push the lead to 5 games to 3, and that single break turned out to be enough. The American closed out the set, and just like that, the match was level, forcing a decisive third set. Now here's where things get genuinely dramatic, because the start of that third set gave absolutely no indication of what was coming. Eala held her opening service game cleanly, then broke Anisimova's serve to jump ahead 2 games to love. Do the math on where that puts her. She's up a break in the final set. She's 2 games away from potentially closing this thing out, and if she manages to finish the job, she extends her record against top 10 players to an incredible 10 wins against just for losses. This was the moment. This was the position players dream about. 5 points from validating everything the last few months had built toward. 5 points from a signature win that would have echoed across every tennis broadcast and headline for the rest of the week. And then, without warning, she simply stopped winning points that mattered. Anisimova reeled off 6 straight games. 6 in a row, with Eala unable to find an answer for any of them. The match that had been hers to lose slipped away entirely, closing out at 2 hours and 28 minutes, with Anisimova completing one of the more remarkable turnarounds you'll see on the WTA Tour this season, her second win over a top 20 opponent all year. After the match, Anisimova didn't hide how significant the win felt for her. She talked about pushing through the middle stages of the contest, about finding a way to fight when things weren't going her way early, about respecting just how tough an opponent she'd been up against, and how much work it took to turn the match around. She also spoke about the crowd, acknowledging that a lot of the support in the stadium had understandably been behind Eala, someone widely loved on tour, but saying she appreciated every bit of encouragement she got anyway given how difficult the challenge in front of her had been. It's the kind of quote you'd expect from a competitor who knows she just clawed her way back from the brink rather than dominating from start to finish, because make no mistake, for the majority of that match, the American was on the back foot. For Eala, the immediate aftermath was brutal to process. Her record against top 10 opponents this season sat at 3 wins and 3 losses, with an overall mark of 9 wins against 5 losses against that caliber of competition. Her 5-match winning streak against elite players had come to an end in the worst possible way, blowing a lead in the final set of a tournament worth over $7 million in prize money. On the surface, this reads like a simple story of a young player choking under pressure, folding when the moment got too big. That's the easy narrative, the lazy narrative, the one that gets thrown around in comment sections without a second thought. But here's where the real story starts to emerge, because when analysts went back and actually dug into the numbers surrounding this match, they found something that had almost nothing to do with nerves or mental toughness, and everything to do with something far more physical. The uncomfortable truth is this. Alex Eala had been the busiest player on the entire WTA Tour all season long. 56 matches played since the start of the calendar year, more than any other woman competing at the professional level. Since the beginning of July alone, nobody on tour had logged more time on court than she had. Before she even set foot in Cincinnati, she had already played 8 matches in 12 days, traveling across 2 different countries to do it. 5 matches in Washington, 3 more in Toronto, and then straight into a grueling 3-set battle in Cincinnati that stretched past 2.5 hours. Stack all of that on top of each other, and you start to see a completely different picture forming, one where the collapse in that final set wasn't about mental fragility at all. It was about a body that had simply run out of gas after weeks of non-stop competition, a tank that had been running on fumes long before that final set even began, and that 20-minute marathon 5th game in the very first set may well have been the moment the tank finally hit empty, even if nobody watching live could have known it at the time. Tennis analyst Liam McMillan, writing for Tennis 365 and Yahoo Sports, put the concern into blunt terms that are worth sitting with for a moment. He pointed out that if Eala made it into the second week of the US Open, she would essentially be completing 8 straight weeks of competitive tennis dating all the way back to the Washington Open. 8 weeks. No real break. Just tournament after tournament, city after city, match after match. McMillan didn't soften the language either, calling that kind of workload unsustainable for absolutely anyone, regardless of age or conditioning, and going as far as describing it as a serious scheduling misstep for a 21-year-old whose career is still very much in its early, formative stages. And the concerns didn't stop with the main draw commitments either. On top of everything already on her plate, Eala had also agreed to take part in a mixed doubles exhibition alongside Felix Auger-Aliassime, plus a separate exhibition appearance against Eva Jovic at Arthur Ashe Stadium, neither of which would earn her a single ranking point, but both of which would demand more time on court, more physical output, more wear on a body that had already given so much this season. McMillan's take was that this pattern of overcommitting, of saying yes to opportunity after opportunity, without building in proper recovery windows, represented exactly the kind of scheduling error that can quietly derail a promising young career if it isn't corrected. It's worth pausing here to really absorb what this means, because it reframes the entire narrative around that Cincinnati match. This wasn't a player who lacked the mental fortitude to close out a big win. This was a player whose competitive fire had carried her further than her legs could physically sustain. Remember, this is someone who fought off 8 break points in a single game earlier in that very match, someone who refused to back down when Anisimova had every chance to seize control early. That's not the profile of a player who crumbles under pressure. That's the profile of a fighter who simply ran out of fuel after asking her body to do too much for too long without adequate rest. The 20-minute war in that 5th game wasn't just a great piece of tennis theater, it was quite possibly the exact moment the exhaustion tipped over from manageable to decisive, the last major physical investment before the tank hit zero in the deciding set. And here's the part of this story that actually turns a painful defeat into something with a silver lining, because losing in Cincinnati, as brutal as it was in the moment, might end up being exactly what saves her tournament in New York. The US Open begins on August 30th at Flushing Meadows, and thanks to this early exit, Eala now finds herself with nearly 2 full weeks to do something she hasn't had much chance to do all year, which is simply rest. No matches. No travel between cities. No packed schedule demanding she recover in a single day before stepping back onto a court against another elite competitor. Just time, real time, to let her body recover from a North American hard court swing that had asked more of her than almost anyone else on tour. Even Anisimova, the player who benefited directly from this collapse, seemed to understand the magnitude of what she had just gotten through, praising her opponent's toughness and acknowledging just how difficult it had been to find a way past someone playing with that much fight in her. That respect matters because it confirms this wasn't some routine, straightforward loss. It was a genuinely hard-fought battle that could have gone either way, decided in the end not by skill or heart, but by simple physical math, by a schedule that had been pushing a 21-year-old body well past reasonable limits for weeks on end. So, where does this leave Alex Eala heading into the biggest stage in tennis? It leaves her with a choice and, honestly, an opportunity. She now has the chance to walk into the US Open not as the exhausted, overextended player who wilted in the Cincinnati heat, but as someone who used a painful lesson to make smarter decisions about pacing herself for the tournament that matters most. If she manages her remaining commitments wisely, protects her body, and arrives in New York with legs that actually feel fresh instead of running on borrowed energy, there's no reason this early exit can't end up being the best thing that happened to her all summer. The talent was never in question. The fight was never in question, not after what she showed in that first set marathon. The only question now is whether she and her team have learned the lesson Cincinnati was trying to teach, because the warning signs are impossible to ignore at this point, and if the same pattern of overloading her schedule continues without adjustment, this kind of late match collapse risks becoming less of a shocking anomaly and more of a predictable habit. Nobody wants to see that happen to a player with this much promise, someone who has already proven she can hang with and beat some of the very best competitors in the sport. What happens next is genuinely fascinating to think about. Picture it. A young player from Manila, still processing a gut-wrenching defeat, arriving in New York with something to prove and, for once, actual time on the clock to recover properly before the tournament begins. Does the extra rest translate into the kind of performance everyone knows she's capable of? Does the fire that carried her through that brutal first set in Cincinnati come back stronger once her legs aren't fighting against weeks of accumulated fatigue? Nobody can answer that with certainty right now, but the pieces are in place for a genuine redemption story, and if there's one thing this sport has taught us over and over again, it's that the players who bounce back hardest from a painful, headline-grabbing collapse are often the ones who end up delivering the most memorable runs a few weeks later. So keep an eye on Flushing Meadows, because the version of Alex Eala who shows up there might look nothing like the exhausted competitor who ran out of steam in Cincinnati, and if she gets this right, that 6-game collapse might end up being remembered not as her lowest moment of the season, but as the wake-up call that set up her biggest one. If this story pulled you in, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because we're covering the biggest, most dramatic storylines in tennis every single week, and you will not want to miss what comes next out of New York.